Well, many non-Christian scientists look at Genesis 1 and the order of events in the 6 days and said it's all wrong. I mean, you get claims like, why does Genesis put the plants on the continents before the animals in the ocean when the fossil record seems to put it the other way around? Or the idea that Genesis mentions sea mammals on day 5 but not land mammals until day 6. What they're overlooking is that we have actual isotopic evidence and even fossil parts that now demonstrate that plants were just as abundant on the continental land masses for 600 million years before the Cambrian explosion of animals in the ocean. So Genesis got it right. And also they're overlooking that creation day 5 talks about God creating sea mammals generically, but it never mentions the creation of land mammals generically. Creation day 6 instead jumps us forward to God creating 3 specialized subcategories of land mammals, those that are most critical for launching and sustaining civilization. Something that's brought up in far more detail in the book of Job. And it's important to recognize that Job 37, 38, and 39 give us a lot of content about the 6 days of creation that are not stated in Genesis 1.
How do you reconcile the description you find in the book of Genesis with what you know as a scientist?
Well, you'd be amused to know, and I must confess it, Simon, that I come from the city in Northern Ireland called Armagh, where Archbishop Usher was, who calculated the date of creation as 4004 BC. And you will remember that he said he reckoned that Adam was created about 9 o'clock in the morning, but he apologized in a letter to Cambridge's Vice-Chancellor that he couldn't be more accurate than that. So
okay, well, what do you do with that?
What do I do with it? Well, we start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then there is a sequence of 6 days, and each of them begins with the phrase, and God said. And God said, and God said. And then after those 6 days of creation activity, God rests on the 7th day. Okay. Now, just looking at that, the first thing to notice is there is a literary pattern. One would logically conclude, I think, prima facie, that day 1 begins with, and God said. And that means that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth is not talking about day 1, but is prior to day 1. Now, instantly, you see, that removes the difficulty with people saying that the Bible insists the earth is young. The Bible doesn't insist the earth is young. It says, in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. It doesn't say what time that was at. And then it gives a sequence of creative acts of God, which we can discuss separately. And interestingly enough, when you check with the Hebrew scholars, they tell you that the tense changes from verses 1 and 2 to verse 3. And the tense that's used in verse 1 and 2 is normally the tense used to describe something that happens prior to the sequence that's following. So there's corroboration from both logic and grammar that perhaps this text is a little bit more sophisticated than people think it is.
So you would take the approach then that there's a lot more going on in this text literarily, so from a literary basis,
yes,
which would indicate that it doesn't demand a literal 6 days.
Well, we have to look at this word literal, you know. Think of this statement. Jesus said, I am the door. Well, we don't understand that to mean that he was a door made of wood or metal or plastic. It's because of our experience of doors made of wood, metal and plastic, though, that we know it's meant at a metaphorical level. But careful, because the metaphor is a metaphor for something real. Jesus is a real door, not a literal door. Or you might say he is a literal door at a different level. That's why I find the word literal actually a bit unfortunate, and it's why many people use the word literalistic to describe that absolutely basic literal level. That's right, you see. Now, pursuing that, I would want to argue that the word day in Genesis 1 and 2 has 4 different meanings, and all of them are literal. Do you want me to prove that to you? Well, take the first. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. How long is that? Well, it's certainly not 24 hours. Because the text is drawing your attention to the distinction between day and night. So that's the first meaning. It's the hours of daylight, roughly 12 at the equator. Okay, come to the next one. And there was evening and morning one day. Now, I know scholars discuss that a little bit, but it seems the consensus is generally that this is the Hebrew way of describing a full 24-hour period. Okay, so that's meaning number 2. Then we read God rested on the 7th day, but there's no formula, and there was evening and morning, day 7. Now that's interesting, as Augustine pointed out centuries ago. And if you ask people theologically what that means, there was a sequence of creative acts and God rested. When did he start creating again? He didn't. The rest is still going on. So that absence of the formula actually opens up a possibility into a theological dimension. So that's 3 meanings. Then you come to chapter 2, and the end of that first section of Genesis, where it says, when God created the heavens and the earth. But actually the word when, and that's I think the ESV translation, it's actually in the day God created. Now, that doesn't mean Tuesday or Monday or the first or all. No, it means when. Just as if I said to you in my young day at Cambridge, we had to wear gowns after dark. You wouldn't say, do you mean Sunday or Tuesday? No, it means that a particular period of time. Now, here's a compressed text, Simon. It uses the word day quite often. It uses it with arguably 4 different meanings. And that's an indicator to me that here we must be very careful before we jump to conclusions. It opens up more logical possibilities. The idea would then possibly be that God speaks, day 1, let there be light. And then that settles down. And then God speaks again. When does he speak again? Well, presumably after the first time. But it seems to me that Scripture allows the possibility that there's an enormous space between the days. That is, they are the point, so to speak, where God inputs a new level of energy and information. Now, the interesting thing about that is that that would mean that so far as any evidence was left in the scientific investigation of the universe, we might expect to find the sudden appearance of new levels of complexity, which is what we do find. And I personally see no compromise with the authority of Scripture on this, but it is a big subject and one needs to have much more time to unpack it.
Well, let's look at Genesis itself then, and putting aside some of these arguments. What are the key messages of Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, and why do they matter?
Well, I like your question, because the sad thing is, with many people, they think that once they have come to a satisfactory, for them, understanding of the days of Genesis, they've understood Genesis. They haven't begun to understand Genesis. Genesis is utterly foundational to the theistic, the Judeo-Christian worldview. It tells us, first of all, that there was a beginning. It tells us that God was the beginner of everything. He is eternal. It tells us that God is not a force, he's a person. And it begins to build up a picture of the universe step by step. It tells us that God had a goal in building up the universe. His goal was to have human beings on it. And they are special. How are they special? They're made in God's image. The Bible is very careful to explain that although the heavens show the glory of God, they weren't made in his image. Human beings were. So they're the pinnacle of his creation. That immediately puts a stamp on their values. And it tells us he created them equal, male and female. That is an enormously important thing for the value of men and women in the contemporary world. We read of sin entering into the world. We read of the damage it does, the fracture between God and human beings. And because of that, we begin to understand why the way back must include where the fracture occurred. The fracture occurred because people couldn't trust God, so they have to learn to trust God again, and how that's brought about. It's those things that are vastly important. Much more important than the days of Genesis, if I might say so, because I notice that they are not mentioned in the New Testament at all.
Okay, the cosmic background radiation that Fred Heron refers to in that book is the radiation left over from the creation event. And because it's from the creation event, it pervades the entirety of the universe. So everywhere you look, you see this cosmic background radiation. And Fred is right. This is where we get our strongest scientific evidence for a transcendent cosmic creation event. I'll address that tomorrow, but I want to make one important caveat. It's the strongest scientific evidence we have. It's also the most complicated scientific evidence we have. And often when I'm talking to a lay audience, I prefer to give them things that are much simpler to understand, to show them scientifically we live in a Big Bang universe. Like the fact that we can look at distant galaxies, and the farther away we look, the more crowded together are the galaxies. Well, that's a good demonstration that we must be living in an expanding universe, because we can actually see through photographs that the galaxies are getting farther and farther apart. Another easy piece of evidence is that we can measure this cosmic background radiation in distant gas clouds, where you're looking back in time. And we do that, we notice that the temperature of that radiation gets hotter and hotter as we look farther and farther away. And we can measure exactly how hot it is and see if it matches what the Big Bang creation model would predict for the cooling of the universe. And that's been done at 9 different distances, and it's right on the money. The Big Bang predicts exactly what the astronomers are observing. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now you notice I got universe up here. The word universe you'll never find in the entire Old Testament. You will in the New Testament. That's because the Greeks had a word for the universe. But in biblical Hebrew, there is no word for the universe. Instead, they have this phrase, the Shamayan Ares, the heavens and the earth. You'll see it 9 times in the Old Testament. Every single time it refers to the totality of physical reality. So whenever you see that phrase, the heavens and the earth, it means all the matter, energy, space, and time throughout the entire universe. And it uses the word create, the word bara, which means to create something brand new that never existed before. So the text is literally saying there's a beginning where matter, energy, space, and time come into existence by the hand of God. Now, of course, Genesis 1:1 is not the only place that talks about this singularity beginning for the universe. There are many verses. Hebrews 11:3 says this, the universe was formed at God's command, so what was seen was not made out of what was visible. Well, what is it that we scientists can detect? We can detect all manner of phenomena within matter, energy, space, and time. So what this passage is saying is the universe came from beyond matter, energy, space, and time. 2 Timothy 1:9, this grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. One of several passages in the Bible actually speak about a time beginning that's consistent with the beginning of the universe. Now this is important because in every other religion, it talks about God or gods or cosmic forces creating within space and time that eternally exists. The Bible stands alone and says, no, God creates independent of space and time. And space and time didn't even exist until God created the universe. Now, I was reading this at age 17 and 18, which was a time when physicists were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And we now have over 30 of these space-time theorems, the most powerful of which is the following, which says that any universe that expands on average throughout its history must have a beginning where a causal agent outside space and time creates space, time, matter, and energy. And what's fascinating about this theorem, it was produced by 2 physicists who spent 10 years trying to find some way to look at the universe where they wouldn't have to concede a being beyond space and time that creates it. But after a 10-year search, they actually developed the most powerful of the space-time theorems. Now, this theorem is true if the universe expands, but that's something that no astronomer or physicist doubts today. And incidentally, the Bible said it first. You see in Isaiah, Job, Jeremiah, Zechariah, the Psalms, repeated statements that the universe continuously expands at the hand of God. No scientist even dreamed of a continuously expanding universe until Einstein produced his theory of general relativity. When he solved the equations, it predicted cosmic expansion. But for thousands of years, the Bible said it. For thousands of years, the Bible is the only book in the hands of humanity that said we live in a continuously expanding universe. Now that we can prove that beyond any shadow of doubt, this is evidence that the Bible truly does have predictive power, the power to predict future scientific discoveries and historical events thousands of years ahead of time. That's Genesis 1:1. This is what establishes that a God beyond space and time must have created the universe. Genesis 1:2 changes the frame of reference from the universe to the surface of planet Earth. And this is where skeptics get tripped up. They think that the frame of reference for the entire text is the universe as a whole. That's true for Genesis 1:1, but Genesis 1:2 changes the frame of reference to the surface of planet Earth, which means we're to understand the account of the 6 days from a perspective below the clouds, not above the clouds. God was hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. Then it lists 4 initial conditions: that it's dark on the surface of the waters, that the water covers the entire surface of the earth, no continents, no islands, and the earth is empty of life and unfit for life, formless and void, tohu wa bohu in the Hebrew. Now, this is significant because when it says it's dark on the surface of the waters, it can be dark because of the lack of light, or it can be dark because the clouds won't let light pass through. Which is why when you get into the first creation day, the text says, "Let there be light." Notice it doesn't say that God creates the light. It doesn't say God makes the light. It says, "Let there be light." Now, that means there was light in the universe. When God creates a universe of matter, energy, space, and time, it is filled with light, but it's dark on the surface of the waters. And what God does on creation day 1, he transforms the atmosphere of the earth from opaque to translucent. Now, at age 17, I probably had an advantage because I had enough astronomy and physics under my belt to realize any planet the size of Earth will begin with an opaque atmosphere. Venus still has an opaque atmosphere. Earth had an atmosphere 3 times as dense as Venus at the beginning. But something happened whereby it lost almost all of its atmosphere and light could pass through. Now, this is something that Genesis 1, I would argue, implies, but there are 3 creation accounts in the Bible that also take you through the 6 days of creation. And they're Job 38 and 39, Psalm 104, and Proverbs 8. And when you go to Job 38, where it speaks about creation day 1, it gives you this explicit clarification. God speaks and he says, "I made the clouds its garment," it referring to the waters that covered the whole surface, "and wrapped it in thick darkness." Notice that Job here is explicit. It's dark, not because of the lack of light. It's dark because God wrapped the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. Now, we have a DVD at the back, I think we do anyway, Journey Toward Creation. It's been shown on 6 different television networks. It's where I take you on a kind of a travel log from the surface of the earth to the very edge of the universe. And we call it Journey Toward Creation because the farther away you go, the farther back in time you travel. And today, astronomers have the tools where we can actually directly image the moment when the universe was being created. We can watch God creating the universe through our telescopes. We've been able to do that for the past 20 years. But in this DVD, we show you how God transformed the Earth that had an opaque atmosphere into a planet that had a translucent atmosphere, an event whereby Earth lost 99.9% of its water and 99% of its atmosphere. So when the Earth was young, it had an enormous amount of water. And with that much water, we would have never had continents. It was crucial that the water be almost entirely removed and the atmosphere almost entirely removed. And incidentally, the same event gave birth to the moon. And because of the moon, our rotation axis doesn't flip back and forth like the other planets. It is rock steady because of the gravity exerted by our moon. In fact, we can now identify 20 different features of the moon that are supernaturally designed to make possible the existence of advanced life here on planet Earth. So that same event also leads to the formation of an abundant, stable water cycle. Water is the second most abundant molecule in the universe. We're finding water everywhere. But what's unique about the Earth, it's a planet that has a thin layer of water, and it has water in all three states: frozen, liquid, and vapor. And this is what's critical for the support of life, and in particularly advanced life, that you have water in all three states where it cycles from one form to the other. So this is what God did on creation day 2. Let there be water above, referring to the water vapor, and water below, referring to the liquid water and the frozen water. Now this is brought out in much more detail in Job 37 and 38. So often what you see in Genesis 1 is a single sentence, and you go to the other creation accounts and you'll find one or whole 2 chapters that expand in detail exactly what God was doing on creation day 2. And then we move into creation day 3, and the text says, let there be land masses. And so this is when continents begin to appear, and we have now a planet with both oceans and continents together. Today we understand the process of the growth of continents. It's called plate tectonics, and we live in a state where we get to feel plate tectonic activity on a fairly regular basis. In fact, where I live in Southern California, our mountains are going higher by about 9 millimeters a year. So I tell my sons that if they keep our property, they will be the owners of future mountain property. I mean, eventually it's going to rise up a few thousand feet. So, but what's interesting is that about 18 months ago, geophysicists were able to reconstruct the growth of the continental land masses in some detail. And so this is what it looks like. The planet, indeed, we can show through our studies, begins as a water world where there's no land masses at all. But then we begin to see plate tectonic activity gradually producing more and more continental landmass. But what I want you to notice on the slides here is the period where you get the most aggressive growth of continental landmass. Notice it happens a little bit more than halfway back in the history of the planet. Well, where does it put it in the creation days? It puts it in the second part of creation day 3, which is consistent with what we see in this reconstruction. The time scale is the same. If you overlap 6 days over this, you've got a consistent picture from the reconstruction of the plate tectonic activity with what the Bible declares. That was, the first part of creation day 3. On the second part of creation day 3, the text says, let the land, the newly formed land, produce plants. Now, I remember debating Michael Shermer of the Skeptics Society on this at a couple of occasions on university campuses. And this is something he roundly ridiculed. He says, we have no evidence for plants showing up that early on the continental land masses. And he ridiculed the idea that plants show up before the Cambrian explosion of marine animals. And I said, well, this is what the Bible says. And moreover, we need to appreciate that plants don't fossilize as easily as animals. So it's no surprise that we can't find the fossils of these first plants on the continental land masses. However, thanks to some discoveries made, one was just made 5 weeks ago, and one was made about 14 months ago. We now have direct physical proof that what the Bible says about the land plants is indeed correct. The first is a paper by Knopf and Kennedy in the British journal Nature. And in that journal, they document that we have isotope evidence proving that photosynthetic plant activity was just as abundant on the continental land masses for the 200 million years previous to the Cambrian explosion as the 200 million years after the Cambrian explosion, the explosion of marine animal life. And then another paper, this one dating back just a few weeks ago, literally April 13th, also in nature, where we not only have isotope evidence, we have actual fossils showing that life goes back on the continental land masses 650 million years before the Cambrian explosion. And so today, Genesis 1 has been fully vindicated by these scientific discoveries. But it's not a surprise that it's taken us this long to verify what the Bible has said for thousands of years. And of all the creation accounts that I've read in the different religions of the world, Genesis 1 is the only one that gets it right. Creation day 4, it says, "Let there be lights appearing in the sky." And it refers to the great light, the moon, and the great light, the sun, the lesser light, the moon. And when I was reading this for the first time at age 17, it was clear to me the text was talking about a second transformation of the atmosphere, where it goes from opaque to translucent, creation day 1, and creation day 4, translucent to transparent. Now, I grew up in coastal British Columbia, so I knew all about translucent skies. That's where it's overcast, and you can't see anything beyond the clouds. In fact, I remember one winter where it rained non-stop for 72 days, day and night. It doesn't quite happen like that here in Redding, I understand. You can see why I wasn't all that impressed when I read the account of 40 days of rain. I said, hey, I've seen 72. But of course, when I read the text, it said torrential rain for 40 days and 40 nights. I've never seen torrential rain for more than that in British Columbia. But what does make the interpretation of this text fairly obvious is what it says in verse 15. So, verse 14, "Why do the sun, moon, and stars become visible as distinct objects on creation day 4? Well, when you read what happens on creation day 5 and 6, God creates animal life. And this animal life needs to know where the sun, moon, and stars are. In fact, it says in Genesis 1:15 that God creates the sun, moon, and stars to serve as signs, to mark seasons and years. Now, if you're a bird, if you're a mammal, in fact, if you're a clam or an oyster, you need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky, at least on occasion, so you can reproduce at the right time of the year, so you can migrate at the right time of the year, and hibernate and feed at the right time of the year. Now, the life that precedes creation day 4 is of such simple nature that doesn't matter. If you're a bacterium, you really don't care where the sun, moon, and stars are. But if you're an amphibian, that's important to know that. Now, what has caused some consternation in the Christian community is verse 16, because it says, God made 2 great lights, and he also made the stars. And this is where the belief has come from that the sun, moon, and stars did not exist until creation day 4. But the problem is the Hebrew language doesn't have verb tenses at all. And so when you're translating from Hebrew, which has no verb tenses, into English that does, then you can have a problem with the timing of what's being claimed in the original Hebrew text. Now, the way the Hebrew verb language is set up is they have 3 different Hebrew verb forms. One for commands, do this, do that. One for action that's not yet finished, and one for action completed at some time in the past. Now, when verse 16 says, so God made the sun, moon, and stars, it's in the completed form, which means that by creation day 4, the sun, moon, and stars are already completed entities. Yes, God made them, but he didn't make them on the 4th day. He made them before the 4th day. And if you go back to Genesis 1:2 and 1:1 and 1:3, it's clear that God made them before the 6 creation days. So the sun was there, the moon was there, the stars were there, but they don't become visible to creatures on the surface of the earth until the 4th day. It's necessary that the atmosphere become transparent. Now today we know it's the great oxygenation events that transformed our atmosphere from translucency into transparency. I'll show you a graph of that in my second talk tonight. But again, if you go back to the book of Job, it makes crystal clear what's happening with the atmosphere on planet Earth on creation day 1 and creation day 4. Now we move into creation day 5. And here the text talks about the emergence of small sea animals. This is a reference to the Cambrian explosion. 543 million years ago, we see this sudden burst of all these thousands of new species of life. In fact, we see more phyla coming into existence at that moment than we do in the rest of the history of the Earth. It's a classic case of evolution going the wrong way. Everything shows up all at once, and we have between 50 and 80 phyla. Now, if you don't know what that term means, phyla means basic body plan. So, for example, all of us in this audience are chordates, which means we have a basic body plan of a tube inside a tube. So we have our spinal column, and then we kind of have our rib cage. That's our basic body plan. All vertebrates are chordates, for example. Well, chordates were created at the Cambrian explosion. We see fish at the base of the Cambrian explosion. And so you have 50 to 80 phyla that show up all at once. Today we have only 30. So a lot of the Cambrian explosion phyla that were there have long since disappeared. How many phyla have we had come since? 3 or 4. But in the Cambrian explosion, you get between 50 and 80 showing up all at once. So clearly the hand of God. And by the way, it's because of the Cambrian explosion animals that we have oil that we can mine to drive our cars here. So you might want to thank God for the Cambrian explosion when you celebrate Thanksgiving. And then you move into the latter part of creation, day 5. And for the second time only, we see the text using the word bara to create something brand new that never existed before. And that's a reference to the soulish animals. Animals that are not just purely physical, they're physical and soulish. And it refers to God creating the birds and the sea mammals. Now, these are creatures that God endows with mind, will, and emotions so that they can nurture one another, relate to one another, but also serve and please human beings. And I'm going to give a talk tomorrow morning on the latest scientific research that demonstrates that every species of bird and mammal is uniquely designed to serve and please human beings in a different way from all other soulish life. And God gave us these animals to enjoy and to sustain our civilization. Now, skeptics will often ridicule the fact that Genesis, or the 5th and 6th creation days, are backwards, because the fossil record tells us land mammals predate sea mammals. But notice what's going on here. Creation day 5, it talks about God creating birds generically and sea mammals generically. But when you get into creation day 6, it doesn't do that. It jumps ahead to 3 highly specialized kinds of land mammals that God created specifically to launch and sustain human civilization. So it never talks about God creating land mammals generically. Rather, it jumps ahead to the very latest land mammals that God created before human beings. And talks about 3 kinds. Talks about the short-legged land mammals. These would be the rodents. You say, what do we need rodents for? Well, if you know anything about anthropology, rodents were crucial for the early development of clothing for human beings. These animals are warm-blooded and they're tiny. They lose heat very rapidly to their environment. So how do they survive in a climate that's a little bit chilly? They grow luxuriant fur. That's how they keep themselves warm. Early humans quickly harvested these creatures and used them to make clothing. It's much easier to make a fur coat out of rodents, for example, than to try to do it with cows. And you get a much more luxuriant fur, easy to sew together. And incidentally, these little rodents are serving us in a completely different way today. We don't need them for fur coats. We have artificial materials. But God designed these rodents with DNA that's identical to human DNA when it comes to the chemical pathways for memory. And so thanks to these mice and rats, we're now developing medical advances to deal with dyslexia, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. Now, if you're an evolutionist, you would have to say, well, we must be having a common ancestor with mice and rats, because after all, our DNA that governs brain memory pathways is identical, whereas for the apes, it's radically different. Now this is what's interesting, because today you've got atheists saying, look at these DNA similarities we have with the apes, we must have a common ancestor. Well, the DNA similarity basically ends at the major organs that we have. And naturally, you want to use the same kind of DNA for a baboon liver as you would a human liver. But the fact is, we share DNA with many different animals. And in each case, we're able to exploit that for medical advance. So again, Thanksgiving, you might want to thank God for all those mice and rats that he created. But then the text goes on and talks about two kinds of long-legged land mammals that he made. The long-legged land mammals that are easy to tame, contrasted with those that are difficult to tame. Now this is expanded in quite a bit of detail in Job 38 and 39. And again, the concept is this. God created these animals, some to serve human beings, others to please human beings. And the thing we know about the herbivores that are long-legged, they make excellent farm animals. They're cheap to feed, they're easy to take care of, they enjoy human contact, and they provide abundant supplies of leather and food and milk, musical instruments, wool. They're great. But they make terrible household pets. You really don't want to bring a cow into your living room. You'll quickly discover that it's impossible to housebreak a cow. You'll also discover just how many noxious gases they emit when they consume and digest their food. And they've got to spend virtually all their day eating and defecating. And so this is really not a suitable household pet. Moreover, they're not able to enter into the depth of emotional relationship with you that a carnivore can. Now I've got a lion pictured here. There's far too few of them that we could use for household pets, but one thing research has shown is that of all the carnivorous animals out there, they're the ones that are capable of the most affectionate relationship with a human being. I'll actually talk a little bit about that tomorrow. And so, again, God gave them to serve and to please. Now, we've got carnivores in our house. And the thing I've noticed about carnivores, they can consume all of their daily caloric needs in about 2 minutes a day. A cow, it's 12 hours a day. A dog or a cat, it's 2 minutes a day. And then they're free to spend the rest of the day entertaining the family. Well, the end of creation, day 6, once again, it uses the word create, something brand new that never existed before. We're not like the birds and mammals that are physical and soulish only. We are body, soul, and spirit, the only species that God created in the image of God. As God is body, soul, and spirit, referring to Jesus Christ, the fullness of the deity dwells in him in bodily form, so are we. And that's the 6 creation days. But then when you come to creation day 7, it says this: there was evening and there was morning for the first 6 days, but there is no evening and morning for day 7. And when I saw that at age 17, I said, could it be we're still in the 7th day? And then I read Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4, and realized indeed that's correct. We are still in God's 7th day of creation. Hebrews 4, live your lives in such a way that you can enter into God's 7th day. Now, the 7th day is when God ceases from his work of creation activity. He doesn't cease from everything. It's kind of like our Sabbath. We stop our employment, but we still feed our children. And we focus on worshiping God. God's doing the same thing. For 6 days he creates. On the 7th day, he targets the problem of evil and suffering. And he begins to perform miracles in the spirit realm, but he ceases from performing physical creation miracles. And when I saw that at age 17, it answered something for me that had bothered me ever since I was 9 years old. This is what's called the fossil record enigma. Because I also studied biology, and what I realized is we have all this evidence for aggressive speciation before humanity, but we can't document anything happening after humanity appears. In fact, we see an average of 1 new species appearing every year before the human species arrives. But afterwards, virtually nothing. Maybe some plant species, But keep in mind, biologists have 16 different definitions for what a species is. When it comes to mammals, everyone agrees we have yet to see a single mammal speciation event. What's the answer? For 6 days God creates. On the 7th day he stops, which is why we don't see it. But also explains why the vast majority of scientists say to the public, we see no evidence in our scientific research for the hand of the supernatural. Well, I'm an astronomer, but there's only about 10,000 of us worldwide. There's over 3 million research biologists. They far outnumber us in the physical sciences. And almost all of them confine their research to the present era. Whereas we astronomers are getting our data from the past, because it takes time for the light of stars and galaxies to get to our telescope. So that explains why the majority of astronomers, mathematicians, and physicists believe in God and an afterlife, and why only a tiny minority in the life sciences believe in God and an afterlife. We in the physical sciences are getting our data from the 6 days. Those in the life sciences are predominantly getting their data from the 7th day. If you're getting your data from the 7th day, you're not going to see the miraculous hand of God in physical creation activity. He's at rest. But if you're getting your data from the 6 days, you see it everywhere. And indeed, I'll be talking tomorrow about how ubiquitous the evidence for supernatural intervention is in the astronomical record. Well, in closing, let me deal with, I think, what is still a controversial issue within the English language church. And that is the meaning of the Hebrew word yom that's translated day. And it has 4 different literal definitions. By the way, that's true of virtually every biblical Hebrew noun. The word translated earth has 5 different literal definitions. The word for heaven has 3 different literal definitions. That explains why Paul said to the Corinthians, I was taken up to the 3rd heaven, because they would have appreciated that there's 3 different literal definitions for heaven in Hebrew. Yom can mean part of the daylight hours, so it could be as short as 15 minutes. It can mean all of the daylight hours, say about a 12-hour period. It can mean one rotation period of the earth, which right now is 24 hours, although when God first created life, it was more like 4 or 5 hours, but today it's 24 hours. And it can mean a long but finite period of time. It's also crucial to realize that yom is the only biblical Hebrew word that you can use for a long time period. You know, in English, we have 12 different words or more for a long period of time. Age, era, epoch, eon. In biblical Hebrew, the only word you got is the word yom. Because sometimes people say, well, if Moses meant 6 long time periods, why didn't he say so? He used the only biblical construct to say so. Now, Genesis 1, if we understand that the literal definition, and incidentally, it's not enough to take the Bible literally, we have to take it literally and consistently. The reason why I believe that yom is a long time period and not 24 hours, it's the only way I can read all 27 biblical creation accounts without contradiction. If you go to Genesis 2, notice how much time transpires between God creating Adam and creating Eve. Yet Genesis 1 tells us that he created both the human male and the human female on day 6. Given that there must have been several months between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve, it's not just the 7th day that must be a long time period, but the 6th day as well. Well, once we understand that yom does mean a long time period, and the frame of reference for the 6 creation days is the Earth's surface, not the universe, here's a score you get when you compare the statements in Genesis 1 with the established scientific record. You get a score of 4 for 4 on the initial conditions and 10 for 10 on the description and the order of the events of creation. Now, if you go through the holy books of the religions of the world, you'll find about 100 different accounts of creation. The best I've found outside of the Bible was the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians. Describes 14 events and gets a score of 2 out of 14. The Bible is the only one that gets a perfect score. 14 for 14. In conclusion, the more we learn about nature's record, the more reasons we gain to trust the accuracy of Genesis 1, and the more reasons we gain to challenge skeptics to consider the truth claims of the Bible and the offer that Christ makes for them on the cross. Or another way I could put it, if God cared and supernaturally intervened to such a great degree as we see described in Genesis 1 in preparing the earth and its life for humans, then how much more must he care and supernaturally intervene in the life of every human being? You know, I've run into people who say, I read in the Bible that God performs miracles, but I don't see it happening. Well, here's where you can see it happening. Start sharing your faith with strangers. Start taking an active role in the fulfillment of the Great Commission, and you'll see miracles happening on a daily basis. And I can testify personally of just how often God supernaturally intervenes. Because why? The workers are few. And God has to supernaturally intervene to get the prepared workers in front of people that are ready to listen. And he will.